As we discussed in the last lecture, natural selection is going to be unequal survival and reproduction. So if we go back to two terms that we talked about previously, the phenotype is the observable properties. The genotype, on the other hand, this is the actual genetic makeup. So this is telling us which alleles are there. Now think about these two right here. Which one does natural selection work on? Natural selection is definitely going to work on phenotype, and it's important that we understand that. The genotype is the genetic makeup. It certainly has an impact on determining the phenotype of an individual, but it's the phenotype that's going to be interacting with the environment and the surroundings of the individual in some way. So do understand that phenotype is what natural selection operates on. If we talk about two very similar terms, we have Darwinian fitness and we have relative fitness. Darwinian fitness is the fitness that Darwin discussed in his book, Origin of the Species. Darwinian fitness is basically survival of the fittest, and I'm sure you've heard that term before. The most fit individuals, the best individuals, they will survive into the next generation. Well, now we look at it a little bit different and we discuss this as relative fitness. So if you look at the definition of relative fitness here, we have the contribution of a genotype to the next generation compared to the contributions of alternate genotypes for the same locus. So basically, how well does one species do, or one genotype really do, compared to another genotype in the population? That's what we're talking about. And again, it is the genotype that is contributed to the next generation, but it is the phenotype that natural selection is actually having its impact on. Let's look at some different types of natural selection. Natural selection can be directional, diversifying, or stabilizing. So if we start with the population that you see here on the top, that's our original population. Notice that we have a lot of different fur colors in these mice. Directional selection, what that's going to do is it's going to select for one end of the spectrum. So we may be selecting for darker mice, as we see in this particular graph. You could have some kind of event or change in the environment where it was selected in the other direction. But regardless, we see differential success in reproduction of one type of fur color over another. So we see a shift in the overall fur colors in the population. That's directional. We could have diversifying. In this case, we have a decrease in the mid-range fur types. It may be that those have more difficulty hiding. Perhaps the light-colored ones have a location or surroundings that they can blend in with very well, and the dark ones have their own environment that they can blend in with very well, and the intermediate ones do not. So this is what we call diversifying selection. What it means is that the two ends of the spectrum get further and farther apart from each other. The last one, stabilizing selection, that is going to specifically select for the intermediate phenotypes. So we start to see even fewer of the extreme colors here. So we have fewer white colored ones or light tan, and we have fewer darker ones. We have a lot more of the medium colored individuals. Another thing that we have that can contribute to microevolution is sexual selection. So what this is saying is that we have non-random mating. So with sexual selection, there is a difference between the mates that get chosen. We can have what we call sexual dimorphism, which is something that we have in many species, and I'm sure you've seen this in a number of species as well. We've got the peacock example here where the male looks very different from the female peacock. So we know that the male has big, bright feathers. The female does not. We've got some snails here where we have the same thing, and then you have some pheasants. This is what we call sexual dimorphism. Marked differences in appearance that really are not directly associated with reproduction. It's just the fact that the males and the females do look a lot different from each other. We can also talk about intrasexual and intersexual selection of a mate. So we have non-random mating, and part of this is because of the way the competition or the selection takes place. So with intrasexual selection, this is competition within a single sex. So this means that two males are going to compete with one another to win the affection of the female. Okay, or they're going to compete with each other so that they have the opportunity to mate with the female. But the female herself is not going to be involved in that competition. Intersexual selection, on the other hand, is the choosing by the female. So if we look at some pictures that show this, we're talking about intrasexual. We've got competition between two males that are trying to win the affection of the female or win the breeding rights to the female. This happens in a lot of different mammals. We see this. So you have seen the classic examples of two rams actually fighting with each other. We've got a lot of times different lions fighting with each other. So you have what ends up being one male lion that has the opportunity to mate with all of the females in the lion pride. If we talk about the other side, the intersexual selection, where the female is doing the choosing, this is where you start to see things like those brightly colored birds, the bright peacocks that have the huge tail feathers. Okay, so the males are obviously making themselves a lot more conspicuous to predators, but the reasoning behind this is that females are looking at the males and they're choosing their best option. It's thought that the bright colors that we see in a lot of the birds, maybe that signals to the female that this individual has some healthy genes there. It's a very healthy individual. Okay, that's some of the theory behind it. But either way, the female is selecting the male, and so if you have a male that does not look so great, he may never have the opportunity to mate with a female and then pass those genes off to the offspring. So keep in mind with all of this, it's not just survival. We also want to have individuals that are passing their genes on to their offspring. So we want reproduction as well. We talk about preservation of genetic variation. So we do have natural selection taking place. We have sexual selection taking place. We have all of these different things taking place in the world around us. And you might think that with this, we would have eliminated a lot of the genetic diversity that's around us, so that these things are going to select for the perfect genotype. Well, we do have preservation of genetic variation for a number of reasons. And one of those is the fact that we are diploid. So remember, by diploid, we're talking about having two copies of each allele. Well, if we have two copies of each allele, it's very possible for maybe a copy that's not so great to survive into the next generation. So think about the carriers that we have for a lot of genetic disorders. That genetic disorder is not a good thing, but someone can survive just fine with that one allele there as long as they have a good allele. So you have a lot of heterozygous individuals here with these hidden recessive alleles that they can kind of carry along and still pass on to their offspring and the next generation. So in that case, we don't see that little a just disappearing from the population, even if it happens to be for something that is quite bad for the species. We can also have what we call neutral variation. Well, neutral variation would be when the phenotype has no effect on survival. An example of this would be something like fingerprints. It doesn't matter what our fingerprints look like. They're all different. So we have a maintenance of this genetic variation in our phenotype, which happens to be our fingerprints and what they look like. So there's many things like that that does not affect whether we survive. Think about things like blood type. It doesn't matter whether we're A, O, AB, A positive. We have equal chances of survival. That's what we're talking about with neutral variation. Another way that genetic variation is preserved is through balanced selection. Balanced selection is the ability of natural selection to maintain stable frequencies of two or more forms in a population. We can talk about some specific examples of this, and one common example is heterozygous advantage. And in this case, we have heterozygous individuals which have a little bit better ability to survive some conditions that may come along. The classic example that we see with this is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia causes the red blood cells to have a sickle shape to them. And when someone has this, it's not a good thing because they have red blood cells that essentially get clogged in the arteries and can lead to a lot of problems down the road. Someone that does not have this has normal disc-shaped red blood cells. So this would be someone in this picture right here that's homozygous dominant. Those are the normal ones. It could also be someone that is heterozygous. Someone that has sickle cell anemia is going to be 2 lowercase a's. Well, you might wonder, why do we have still individuals that are even heterozygous if having that little a is such a bad thing? Well, first of all, they are diploid, so they still have that good allele, the capital A, which is going to help them out. In Africa, where we have malaria being very prevalent, there is an advantage to being heterozygous. In this case, there's actually some resistance that's offered against the malaria-carrying organism, which is a protozoa. We'll talk about protozoans a little bit later in later chapters. But having that allele is going to help these individuals to survive better. The malaria will not be able to replicate as quickly in their cells. So you do tend to see a lot of individuals that have the heterozygous genotype when we look at Africa, because they do survive better than the individuals that are big A, when there is a lot of malaria around. So the heterozygous individuals in this case, they do have an advantage over the others. We can also have what we call frequency-dependent selection. And this means that the survival and reproduction of any one morph or any one phenotype depends on the frequency of that phenotype in the population. Now, this can be a positive selection. It could be a negative selection. Typically, you hear it talked about in a negative way. But one good example of this is if we think about the flu virus. The flu virus, if it replicates a lot and passes to a lot of individuals, becomes very common, then a lot of individuals in the population are going to develop some immunity to that. Okay, so they're going to make antibodies. They're going to be sick for a little while, but they're going to get over it. Well, once all these individuals develop immunity to the flu virus, a specific form of the flu virus, it's now going to be very difficult for that flu to continue to multiply and pass to new individuals because everybody now has immunity to this. Not every person, but it's going to be unlikely that someone that has it is going to come into contact with somebody that's not already immune to it. So it makes it very difficult for that flu virus form to replicate, reproduce, produce more forms of itself. That would be an example of negative selection. If we talk about positive selection, if we have a form of an organism that develops some type of look, perhaps to mimic another organism that might be dangerous or taste bad. If we think about the king snakes look like coral snakes. So once a predator learns that a coral snake is really bad, once it starts seeing all these king snakes looking the same way, it's going to start to lay off of those a little bit. So you might see the king snakes become a lot more popular, a lot more prevalent, just because predators tend to not mess with them based on their looks. So to wrap it up, we want to keep in mind that natural selection cannot develop the perfect organism. So let's talk about why it can't develop the perfect organism. First of all, evolution is limited by time constraints. Okay, so this is a process that takes a lot of time, many generations. So we're talking about thousands of generations to go from one phenotype to another phenotype in a population. The second point here is that the adaptations are often compromises. Think about that brightly colored cardinal. That male is red because he has to be to win the affection of the female. However, he's bright red, and that's going to be a lot more obvious to predators. So it's not necessarily a good thing for him when we're talking about it in a predator situation. The third point is that not all evolution is adaptive. So some evolution might not really cause you to survive better the next generation. It may not change too much. It may be something that's just chance. We talked about genetic drift. So not all evolution is adaptive. So in that case, we're not expecting to get the perfect individual there, especially if it's something that's due to chance. And then we also have to keep in mind what natural selection is working on. Natural selection is working with genotypes and alleles that are present in the population. It can only work on what is presented to it. If you don't have a phenotype there, natural selection cannot work on that. We have to keep in mind that it's selection from what is there. It's not just creating some new individual, some new phenotype that's going to work really well given the conditions. We're just selecting from what's there, and it's unequal success and then reproduction in the next generation. Okay, so in general, we talk about what does evolution produce? Well, in general, it does produce diversity. So when we have evolution, we expect it's a random thing that's taking place. We've got a lot of DNA to work with. We've got a lot of different environmental conditions around us. So if this is working on many different individuals, they've got different blueprints that the evolution can work on, we expect to get some diversity. That's what we see around us. We have to keep in mind that evolution does not necessarily produce complexity. It may actually go the other direction. It may produce an organism that is a lot simpler. Sometimes it's beneficial to be simpler. If you think about bacteria are simpler organisms than a human would be, and they are very successful. So we have millions of bacterial species around us in our world today. So keep in mind that this is not going to just produce the complex, perfect organism in the long run. We're getting a diversity of organisms that may or may not be complex in the end.